Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We had a small technical difficulty, and we'll put it up in the chat window here, as if folks can send that out to anybody they know that we emailed everybody, but there's a new link login. And any rate, I want to thank Dr. Jim Abbott for being willing to talk today. Presentation is a focus on integrity and introduction to TxDOT's Archeological Predictive Modeling program, specifically the PALM. I think most folks know Dr. Abbott, so I'm just going to go ahead and let you all you take it over. And again, thank you for showing up today.
Well, thank you, Brian, and I want to thank everybody for showing up, and thank Esri for hosting, and we're very happy that y'all, got some interest in it. So I'm glad to talk about it. Kind of give you a roadmap for what I'm going to talk about. Apparently, unfortunately, what I need to do is go back and provide some background, which a lot of you are going to be familiar with, but it's kind of necessary to understand the context of what we're doing. So please bear with me if I'm talking below your level, or if I say something that you disagree with strongly. Why don't you wait and we'll hold it till the end, and we can talk about it then, or maybe over a beer sometime. Anyway, what I'm talking about is our modeling program, our Archeological Predictive Modeling program, which is within our CRM program. And if you Google CRM, what you're going to find, much to my chagrin, on the web is that everything that comes up on the first couple of pages relates to customer relationship management, which is something that apparently somebody came up with a few years ago as a way of selling software, probably Microsoft. But that is not what we're talking about. We are talking about cultural resource management, or CRM, which is dealing with cultural resources within the framework of federal, state, local laws. So in short, what we're looking at are legal aspects of archaeology and other aspects of cultural resources. Some of the laws that are important in that case include the National Historic Preservation Act, the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, or ARPA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, and in Texas, the Antiquities Code. But what we're going to be talking about here is the big dog in the room, which is the National Historic Preservation Act. And in particular, we're going to be talking about Section 106. And people have heard about 106, even people that don't know what it is in particular. It's basically the driving law that created our industry. That said, that section of the National Historic Preservation Act is very succinct, very short. It's one paragraph. It essentially says that the federal agency will take into account the effects of an undertaking on any site, building, structure, or object that is included in or eligible for inclusion in the register, and that they will allow the advisory council to comment. So how does that work? That's laid out in some much more extensive regulations. 36 CFR 800 lays out who the players are and what the standard Section 106 process is. That's, in other words, to comply with the law, you go through the process. It also provides for programmatic alternatives, and I'll mention here that TxDOT actually operates under a programmatic alternative, which has that title shown right there. It rolls trippingly off the tongue. Another very important law is or regulation is 36 CFR 60, which includes the criteria for evaluation. Now, what this is doing is actually defining what the law is concerned with, what are historic properties. And finally, there are a number of guidelines, the Secretary of the Interior Standards and Guidelines, ACHP guidance, etc. So what is a historic property? Well, essentially, it's something that's afforded consideration under the National Historic Preservation Act. And importantly, those properties can either be listed on the National Register, you can go look them up ahead of time, or they can be eligible for listing, which is what basically drives the industry to locating and evaluating properties, whether they're eligible. Important players. I don't want to go too deeply into this, but the law lays out 4 basic players. The agency official, that would be the head of whatever individual agency you're looking at. In most cases for us, it's the head of the Department of Transportation, the Secretary of the Department of Transportation. They delegate the responsibilities, of course, all the way down to us, where TxDOT is delegated responsibilities for most of the 106 work that we do from FHWA. The second major player is the Advisory Council, and then consulting parties, including the SHPO, TIPOs, where they apply, tribes, anybody that's applying for federal assistance, et cetera, and the public. But in most cases, the players that we really deal with on most are, it was going to be us, TxDOT, our contractors, the SHPO, who is in Texas, the Texas Historical Commission, and tribes. And what's important about this is that these are the people that you really have to get to buy off on any alternatives like applying predictive models to 106. So how does identification happen? Identification under 106 requires a reasonable and good faith effort, which should be scaled appropriately to what you're looking at. And importantly, it includes the likely nature and location of historic properties within the area. So looking at it in a very simplified form, the 106 process as it is developed consists of, from the project, moving through definition of what the project area is, then identifying resources in that's survey, or in some states they call that phase 1, and then assessing the data content and the integrity of any sites that are located, at least in the archaeological realm. That is testing, phase 2. And then at the end of testing, you make a significance determination, which is your evaluation, and you either determine then, from that point, you determine treatment. So everything above making a significance determination is part of the identification process. Okay, what does a reasonable and good faith effort require? Importantly, it does not require you to look at everything. You can use many different tools to limit what you're looking at and make your efforts count. And this is where predictive models come in. They're referenced in the Advisory Council's guidance. What do we mean by predictive modeling? In archaeology, predictive modeling is doing some type of procedure to predict where archaeological sites are going to occur within the landscape. And in CRM, most predictive models are management tools. They're not really research tools. In other words, where are we going to focus our efforts and focus our limited resources? There's 2 different types of predictive models that are generally recognized. Inductive predictive models are much more common. And what that involves is starting with a known landscape where you know various aspects of the environmental setting and you know where there's a number of sites. And you look at where the sites are located in relationship to various predictor variables and use that to predict where other sites are going to be. So you're starting from known sites and extending that out. Deductive models, in contrast, use theoretical expectations for where sites should be. Relatively uncommon, but that's what we're talking about here. The integrity models are deductive models. So how does a predictive model fit into the 106 process? You can fit a predictive model into an individual project. Say it's a relatively large project, which would be the only reason to really do this, to cut down the area you want to look at. You can put in the predictive model first, and when everybody agrees with it, you can use that to limit the areas where you actually go into the field and survey for resources. And that way, part of the area you're simply shortcutting to no effect, and that way, and concentrating on other aspects, other parts of your overall landscape. Alternatively, you can do a predictive model for a region, and then as projects come up, apply those over and over again to the predictive model. So it kind of works the same way, except for the predictive model exists before any individual project. And the idea there is it would apply to a number of projects. Why would you want to do this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, archaeology costs money. It takes a lot of time, slows things down, requires a lot of effort. And so it makes good sense from a number of perspectives to make what you do count, to not do things that really don't make a lot of sense, and dilute your ability to look in areas where you might get the most bang for the buck. The second reason that you might want to do it is that site locations are restricted by law. So planners, people who are not archaeologists, cannot go look and see where the archaeological sites are or are likely to be. They don't have any idea. They just plan their project and then they deliver it to environmental people who say, oh, yep, you got a problem here, you got a problem there. Predictive models provide a mechanism for planners to kind of at least be able to anticipate where they might have a problem and structure their projects appropriately. Now, here's another contrast, and this is the one that we really are the innovators on, the idea of integrity models. Most models in prehistoric archaeology are behavioral models. They focus on where people choose to live and work. They're looking at what people did. Integrity models instead look at physical processes, and the purpose is to predict where archaeological sites are likely to be preserved through physical processes if they happen to be there in the first place. Physical processes are not simple, but they are far more patterned and predictable than human behavior, which can be predictable at times, but then it changes through time. It responds in a number of ways to a number of different inputs. So integrity models are based on the presumption that sites that are buried and preserved are more likely to retain sufficient integrity to qualify as historic properties. So what we're doing here is we're not looking at all sites. We're mainly concerned with sites that have sufficient integrity to be historic properties. how does that work? Well, when we go back and look at 36 CFR 60.4, the criteria for evaluation of whether a site is actually historic property, you see that there are two requirements. First, they have to possess integrity of location, design, settings, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And they also have to fit one of four categories of importance. Archaeological sites, prehistoric archaeological sites, are almost always eligible under criterion D. That is it for the information that they contain. So an eligible site, a historic property, is going to be eligible because it meets both of those criteria. And a significant site that lacks integrity is not going to be significant. So what the PALM approach does is it elevates consideration of integrity. It allows you to look at the probability of site integrity on a regional basis by looking at physical processes. So that's the introduction. I'm going to move into the history of our program. Phase one is the Houston PALM. That was started, and I'm responsible for most of this stuff. I started this model in 1997 when I started with TxDOT. It's not my only task, but it's one of, this modeling process is one of my major tasks with the agency. And it's evolved. The Houston project early on was completely mapped by hand. It was based on aerial stereopair photographs and using paper soil books. And after several years of that mapping, was able to produce a number of mylars, which were then scanned and spliced together to create the map. I don't expect anybody to read this, but I just wanted to demonstrate that even though I was mapping by hand and just day in and day out during the mapping process going in, there was a very structured method to the madness, moving from generalized environment to sub-environments and then overlaying characteristic of moderate impact and doing the mapping. And the Houston PALM defines 6 different mapping units, and importantly, these mapping units provided explicit recommendations. So surface survey is recommended, deep reconnaissance is recommended, and they also included separate recommendations for shallow and deep potential. Model was released in 2001. It was vector-based, and because of agreements, it belongs to the TxDOT's Houston district. So it really didn't make it out into the general community, except as maps produced by the Houston district and distributed. Right after we were done with one and the ink was drying, we moved into consideration, how do we move forward with this? The next district that was selected, another urban district with a lot of potential to get some bang for the buck, was the Fort Worth district. By this time, early 2002, we had more data available. The Sergo data was appearing. And so I didn't have to use the paper soil books anymore. But I still did hand mapping of landforms. And that was layered with some heads-up map digitizing of disturbance. One of the things that I was not particularly comfortable with during the observation of how Houston was being used was that people were taking the recommendations, the units, far too literally in a lot of cases. So we changed the mapping units from definitive statements of recommended or not recommended to more of a potential statement. So high, medium, low, which kind of put the ball back more in the court of the people who should be making the ultimate decisions. This was published after many fits and starts, finally in 2011. It was again distributed as a vector model, but it was available in the back of the report. So that one is out there. When that was released, then I got asked to think about different ways to do it. And of course, the quality of data and the availability of data over 10 years had increased more. And I began to look at how to approximate the hand mapping I'd been doing inside the GIS system. There were really two problems with that. The first was that I couldn't figure out a method, and I looked a lot, that would produce the type of landform data that I was comfortable with using. With Caleb's efforts to the contrary. And the second issue was that there wasn't really available data to test the model. So what we did is thought about how to solve these problems. The first one, we stepped back and said, well, maybe we don't really need to identify the landform. Maybe all we need to do is identify aspects of the landform that we can map that provide proxies for how important various landforms are. And secondly, what we did was we went back and went to the site files and began to generate the data. When we had those two things, we could move forward. I devised a model that is done inside the computer, doesn't require any hand mapping, thank goodness. It's fairly simple. It's not something that's going to be particularly complex, because all we're doing is producing weighted submodels and then combining them into classes. Importantly, we're still not using site data. It is still a deductive model. Here's what it looks like in terms of the primary data sets that are used. The DEM is used to produce several different layers. The Geologic Atlas of Texas, which had become available in digital form. The Surgo data, we started out using FEMA floodplain mapping, but I abandoned that because it's just not as widely enough available. And we were getting, the same types of information would be imparted by some of the other data. The National Hydrographic Database Plus, which is an extension of the National Hydrographic Database, was used because it included Strehler stream order, which we used that in classifying the stream segments. So those are the data sets that we used. And then to give you a little bit more of a window into it, the red line, the soils, this shows you the process of classifying the soils. Moving through, once again, just shows you that there's a regimented process. Now, importantly, this thing kind of changes as I move through the state doing various areas, because this really isn't intended to drive the classification as much as document the decision process. But you'll notice that once again, we're looking at two different maps. We're looking at shallow potential and deep potential, and then combining them. This is just, you GIS guys are more familiar with this kind of thing than I am, but we're looking at combining rasters in a raster calculator, and then doing classification to divide them up. We, in general, usually use the Jinx method. A lot of it is just what passes the smell test. I look at it, I have a feel for what I think it should look like, and I'm trying to approximate that. Finally, the two shallow and deep potential maps are combined together to produce a single map, according to this schema right here. When we developed this, we then tried to evaluate it by looking at Fort Hood as a test case. Fort Hood is a fairly large Central Texas Army base that has a magnificent inventory of archaeological sites that have been accumulated and evaluated over the years. So it's a great test case that isn't available to many places. So we applied the initial model to Fort Hood. We got fair results. We identified, about 60% of the sites, but that meant we were missing 40%. So I retrenched and looked at what those 40% of sites looked like. What were they? And I also had the serendipitous good fortune of having worked on Fort Hood, so I understood what was going on and what the sites were like, and I was able to identify a couple of different major site types that we were missing. And then we stepped back and devised a method to capture those, which involved actually capturing areas where there was a very rapid change in elevation by running a high-pass filter over the DEM and then scaling that. And when we combined that and layered it on, we were able to rule out about half of the base in terms of potential, and yet still capture 95% of the sites. So we were very happy with that, and we moved forward from there with this combination approach that is based on integrity, but it also includes some components that are behaviorally based, because the locations of those particular sites don't have anything to do with geological processes as we're figuring it out, because burn rock middens are the result of cultural depositional processes, and rock shelters are such small areas of the landscape, they're hard to pick out individually. So we're looking at a compound now, so we renamed it to HPALM, the hybrid potential archaeological liability maps, which indicates that there is a combination of integrity and behavioral aspects to the overall model. The final maps, they're raster based, they're not vector. There are vector versions, but they're just based on a direct conversion from the raster. Pixel resolution is 10 meters, and they are models that can be used with anything else in ArcGIS. Testing the models, my approach is fairly low tech. What I did was compare the model against how sites are being classified by that model, eligible sites and ineligible sites, and the overall landscape. And if the eligible sites are shifted towards the right side of the graph and the overall landscape is shifted towards the left, I'm relatively happy. So there's several examples of how those plot out. We also calculate Kavami's gain statistic, which is just a ratio between the area of the model covered and the percentage of sites that are predicted. And in addition to that, my boss then, before the models are released, does some more in-depth statistical vetting of the models to make sure that he doesn't see issues cropping up. And I'm not going to speak to that too much more, but that information is available. I do want to mention a few examples of specific tweaks and issues of things that come up. Every time I do a model, there seems to be something or other. Here's an example of Crockett County and areas on the Surgo data that are just blank. I think these are areas where the landowners did not allow access. They don't have that. So it required rethinking of how we're going to approximate these areas. And we did separate models just for that little area that left out the Surgo data and then layered that in. Another issue that comes up a lot is we're using the NED data set, 1/3 arc-second data set, which is about 10 meter pixels. And that data set is described as the best data available to get full coverage. And it's interesting, as you go into it, every once in a while you find areas where the data appears to be operating gathered differently. It's a different type of data. And that particularly pops out when you do the high-pass filter that is used for the HPF submodel. And I'm not sure what's going on. I have a feeling it's that they're digitizing topo lines, and so it creates more of a stepped DEM as opposed to a smooth model. But the result is it caused a lot more specific, really, well, what's the best way to say this? It lights up those areas of the model. So we had to go in and delimit those areas and then smooth them to keep from underemphasizing other areas. And there's comparison between the left and the right. And I believe this is the Brownwood model that you're looking at. So status. Currently available, we have about 7 models, and then Houston is floating out there too. You might be able to get it from them. You can't get it from us. There are a couple more models in the pipe, but they are not ready for prime time yet. Each model is produced, bundled with a raster version, a vector version, and documentation, including the overall modeling method that I developed in 2013, and a data release that runs through the testing and any tweaks that were required to produce that individual model. And that's all bundled into a zip file that you would download when you go get it from our website. Brian asked me to talk a little bit about what's appropriate to use these models, and I did speak to that a little bit ago, but I want to come back to it. Now, first of all, these models are only for prehistoric. They are not intended to be the decision maker for the project. They are simply information to be used by a decision maker. Survey decisions should be based on a number of different lines of information and made by somebody who is qualified to do so. The PALM models and HPALM models are simply a tool for that person. A PALM model, HPALM model is not equivalent to a survey decision. And if you're using them that way, you're using them wrong. In summary, PALMs are a map indicating the likelihood for National Register properties. They're based on geoarchaeological principles, and they're scaled appropriately for our use. They're decision support tools. They're not decision makers, and they're mechanisms for our agency and the resource agency, which is the Texas SHPO, to reach consensus on requirements for compliance in advance of individual projects. Distribution happens through our website. I believe you can simply Google TxDOT archaeological model and get to it. But there is the actual URL for the downloads. And with that, I'm done talking, and I'd be glad to take questions.
Okay. Hey, Jim, Gordon has a question for you. I don't know if you see it on the chat. I can read it to you. How sensitive is the model approach to DEM resolution? Would a 1/9 arc second DEM derived from filtered LiDAR yield a different result from the standard 1/3 arc second DEM? Have any tests been done for DEM resolution sensitivity?
I'm sure that a not 1/9 arc model would produce a different looking model. I'm already a little bit uncomfortable with the differing scale of some of the things that we're looking at. In the first place, I don't think my computer could handle doing a district. I know it couldn't with 1/9 arc resolution, with LiDAR resolution. It would choke. I'd have to break it into small pieces of counties one at a time to get it done. And I'm not sure how much that would add. That said, there are certain areas that, I mean, clearly LiDAR data is extremely powerful for looking at sites. And there are parts of the state where you have relatively low relief that it could be quite powerful. I think there are other parts of the state where it's overkill. But we haven't done a whole lot of looking at that because we're operating at multiple county scale on these individual models. So now we're dealing with a 1/3 arc with a 10-meter resolution essentially for these models, and I would encourage anybody to supplement that with more high-resolution models to deal with individual areas, but I can't see doing it for this kind of an effort. Hope that is clear.
Yeah, I think that might have answered the next question. I don't know if you see it in the Q&A. I'll read it, but I think you answered it. The question is high-resolution elevation data becomes available for much of the state, quality level 2 LiDAR. Do you plan to switch to the resulting 1-meter DEMs that are getting ready to be posted through the national map, the primary database for elevation, upgrading from the 10-meter DEMs?
No, I'm not planning on it because I would encourage anybody else to take what I've done and run with it. One of the things that I've wanted to be very explicit in is how everything that I'm doing is very explicit. There's a recipe, a cookbook published in the documents that go along with this, and you can see where the strengths and the weaknesses are and make any improvements on your own. But I've got still half of the state to try and get through before I drop. So I'm probably, something else I wanted to mention is that the integrity approach is not really appropriate to all parts of the state. And we're looking at, I'm not really ready to talk much about it, but we're looking at alternative ways to approach the problem, particularly in the Northeast Texas sands, where integrity doesn't really play a whole lot into eligibility. And there's some other areas too that may look at that. I'm also not clear what happens when we get into the much more pronounced relief out west. So we'll see what happens. I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of problems to solve without going back and trying to redo what I've done so far.
We have another question here. Before I read the question, could you go back to the slide that shows, you know, the kind of the areas that are next in the on the list to be developed? I thought you had a slide like that.
Well, I've got one, not really next areas to be developed, but the ones that are in process, more or less.
Okay, got it. The next question is by Andrea. I have often wondered about the potential for an integrity model to evaluate an area where a site may exist as lacking integrity, potentially due to shallow disturbances, etc., but may mask the presence of deep features, particularly human graves. Do you think this is a concern that really can only be addressed by inadvertent discovery protocols? And thanks, Jim.
I don't believe that it's something that can only be addressed by inadvertent discovery protocols, but I don't think that this particular model has anything to do with where you're going to find any type of intentional excavation. So what really needs to be done there is a behavioral model that locates where cemeteries are and gets your likelihood for encountering a cemetery, prehistoric cemetery, because it's important. But anytime these models are based on natural physical processes, and if somebody's digging a hole and burying it, that completely circumvents that. So these models don't have anything to do with that. Unfortunately, I don't know how to wrap around that other than to do a completely different model and weigh that into the judgments that are made by the archaeologist who is weighing various data. And I'll go back to that right there. That would be, appropriate behavioral models. It'd be nice to get those out. There have been some. Tim Pertolo looked at some stuff down on the coast. I'm not sure, they haven't been really converted to GIS that I know of, but people talk about where cemeteries are, and people, personal experience and knowledge of the qualified archaeologist goes, well, no, we might want to look here. And we just, for that matter, we just had a couple of years ago, one of our archaeologists did that very thing, and we caught a big cemetery in Northeast Texas. It was out of the PROGRAMMATIC area, but it was an area that had already been surveyed, and he, in his opinion, this is Waldo Trull, his opinion was, well, now we need to look some more. And we went back and looked some more, and we caught a cemetery in the edge of a Caddo village site.
Nice. We have another question here. Someone came in late, so if this is already covered, he apologizes. Is statewide coverage planned, and is there a projected timeline for this to be completed?
I'd love to. We'll see what happens. I know from the Fort Worth project and the way things happen and the way other demands tend to crop up on everybody's time, that the best laid plans kind of go out the window. The Fort Worth was originally designed as a 3-year project, I think, and it was ultimately almost 10 years before it got published. And that's just because other things came up. That said, I would really be happy to have the the state, or at least most of the state, mapped before I retire, and that's probably 5 to 7 year time horizon. So we'll see. Can't say more than that.
Okay. Well, I don't see any more questions here. We can just pause for a second and see if. Definitely want to thank Dr. Abbott for sitting in with us today and providing a good presentation. Jim, at our Heights, we had 51 attendees.
No, that's great.
Even with our little ID link, but we recovered from that one quite nicely. So everybody, this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted to our website. So if you missed the beginning, feel free. We'll send out an email to each one of the registrants once that's posted for you all. If you want your PDH, please make sure that we have your first name and last name and email, and we'll use the attendee list here. So please let us know if you didn't get that or not. So I guess with that said, I do appreciate it, Jim, and if you ever need help processing, maybe contact us and we can maybe get some people to help you out. So
all right. Well, thank you, Brian, and thank everybody for your interest in sitting through lunch. And I'd be glad to talk to anybody individually anytime they want to.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. And we'll have our next meeting next month on May 23rd is the next talk. And that email will be going out here real soon, but it's going to be Dr. David Arcter. He works closely with Dr. David Maidman, and it should be a good presentation. So we'll be dealing with the Texas water model. And again, once again, Jim, thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and sign off here.
All right. Thank y'all.